Okay, good morning. We're going to introduce organic chemistry today, which really has everything to do with carbon. What is it? We're going to figure out and relearn the properties of carbon and go into a little bit more depth about some properties and such, and hopefully we can get to isomers. There's no homework associated with this, but you do have the spiral. It's due tomorrow by 3:15. Put all your answers on the Google form. If there's an issue with the test that is due today at noon, I'll try to figure out this morning and then post it on Google Classroom. Okay, so let's take a look. Organic chemistry is really anything that has to do with something that is carbon-based. Carbon-based. They occur extensively in nature. There are about 50,000 inorganic compounds, and those are compounds that don't have carbon in them, compared to over 2 million organic compounds that have been identified. Anything that is life-based, any organism, any living thing, is going to have carbon compounds in it. On the other hand, anything that has smell to it is a specific kind of, a specific group of organic compound. You've probably seen me use these essential oils, and sometimes you do that. Maybe your parents do that, use essential oils as well. These are all carbon-based, and we'll go into some more detail on that later on. Carbon compounds are insoluble. There are a few exceptions for that, but for the most part, they are insoluble. They do not dissolve in water. Compounds containing carbon do not have any electrolytes. Now, we just finished the acid unit, so we know that there are a few exceptions to that. When acids ionize and release their hydrogen, something like acetic acid, it will be able to release the hydrogen, and therefore it does have electrolytes. So this is an exception, but for the most part, carbon compounds don't have electrolytes. They also have low boiling points and melting points. Now remember that low is a relative term, so you'd have to compare it with something that has higher boiling points. Compounds containing carbon require a lot of activation energy. And as a result of that, they're relatively more slow to go through chemical reactions. We mentioned that before. Essentially, the bigger the molecule, the more bonds there are, and therefore the more bonds there are to break and reform in a chemical reaction. So, carbon-based compounds, organic compounds, tend to be bigger than inorganic compounds. They can get absolutely huge. Hundreds of thousands of atoms making up a protein, for example. Carbon compounds produce very strong odors and have high vapor pressure. Now, the vapor pressure thing goes back to the fact that they have low boiling points. The majority of organic compounds are non-polar. There are some that are polar, but the majority are non-polar, so there's not a lot of intermolecular forces going on. And because of that, it's easier for these molecules to separate from each other as a liquid into a gas. And because of that, they tend to have higher vapor pressures. An easy example to think about that is gasoline. You can smell gasoline very, very easily because it is releasing just a second. It's releasing those molecules, and then you can get them up to your nose and smell them. So carbon only forms covalent bonds. It is versatile. It only bonds with itself. Not only, it does bond with itself and other elements. It can form what we call single, double, and triple bonds. And it makes 4 covalent bonds. So we've got different ways to look at how carbon can bond. This is electron dot diagram. We know it as a Lewis dot diagram, but both of those things are synonyms. This is what we call the structural formula. Here's the molecular formula, CH4. We know this substance as methane. And carbon compounds can get incredibly complex because of the different angles at which the bonds are made. So it can grow in any of 4 different directions, and each of those atoms of carbon can branch off as well. So it can form molecules that are incredibly complex, and thankfully so, because we need them as humans to be complex, helping make up our cells. We should also be able to distinguish between the types of formulas. There are molecular formulas, and that tells us how many atoms of each, 2 atoms of carbon and 6 atoms of hydrogen in this particular molecule. There are empirical formulas, and we've already learned about those. Those are the reduced compound. So in this case, I've got ethane here. I can take ethane and reduce it because 2 fits into both of those. So an empirical formula for that one would be CH3. Structural formulas we've also done. We did a lab on that as well. Shows how atoms are bonded in space, how they're shaped, and shows the types of bonds. So here is C2H6. Here's its molecular formula. Here is its structural formula. And something new that you're going to learn is something called a condensed formula. It's a molecular formula that does show some structure. Now it doesn't show it 3-dimensionally, but it does show that these 3 hydrogens are bound to this carbon, and these 3 hydrogens are bound to that carbon. So once we learn how to read that, then we can understand better how those molecules are put together just by using the condensed formula. Now this may be a recap from biology. There are 2 different kinds of fats that you learned about in biology, saturated and unsaturated. We're going to generalize it a little bit more. Saturated formulas are carbon-based compounds that are solid at room temperature. An example would be those that are found in animal fats. So butter, for example. Butter is basically animal fat, and at room temperature it's solid. So they also have, in some cases, and we'll come back to this, have increased chlorine content. They're more likely to have increased chlorine content. And saturated formulas, essentially what it means is that they have single bonds. The other type is unsaturated formulas. And the way we can remember this is saturated, you know, means completely full, like something is saturated with water. Unsaturated means there aren't as many as you could actually fit on here. So the saturated part that we're talking about in unsaturated is the number of hydrogens that can fit on the carbons. Unsaturated are liquid at room temperature. They'd be found in plants. They're healthier for you versus animal fats. Animal fats tend to bring up your levels of cholesterol. Plant-based unsaturated oils, polyunsaturated or completely unsaturated oils, tend to be healthier for you. These tend to have fewer chlorine molecules associated with them, and unsaturated have have double or triple bonds. And in one of the labs that we did in the bonding unit, we learned that certain molecules can form double and triple bonds, and one of those that we looked at was carbon dioxide that has double bonds, and triple bonds in something like nitrogen gas, N2. So saturated versus unsaturated, you should be able to identify if something is saturated or unsaturated. So you can see that all the carbons are bonded with hydrogens all the way around. This is saturated with hydrogens. I can't fit any more hydrogens on here. So there are different, these are structural formulas, yes? And this is a different kind of formula that we probably will not get into, but you should be able to identify it. This is the same thing as that one, just streamlined. Over here I've got a couple examples of unsaturated formulas. And you can see right here that there's a triple bond between these two carbons. Okay, so if it has a double bond, as in this molecule here called benzene, if it has a double bond or a triple bond, all it needs is one of them, it is unsaturated. Saturated has only single bonds. Unsaturated has at least one double or one triple bond. And lastly, isomer. I don't think we're going to get to it yet because we've only got about a minute, but I'll tell you what it is. Two molecules with the same molecular formula, but a different structural formula. So, if we were to figure out, if we could count up the number of carbons and hydrogens, we would see that there's 5 carbons and 12 hydrogens, and each of these has that same number. But you can see that they're structurally different. They can be put together differently. So that essentially is an isomer. And we'll stop there. So isomers have the same molecular formula, but a different structural formula. See you tomorrow.